talking about the road of good intentions. We're talking about all the announcements that were made on Liberation Day in the USA by President Donald Trump and the implications of that, where it leaves us. Does it really imply the end of international trade? Or are we going to see an adjustment of the new world order in terms of trade? Where does it leave South Africa in particular? Some of the trade agreements, what the implications of that are. And Theo Venter is a political analyst. He's going to give us context, and your questions and comments are welcome. I'm going to make notes here, profusely going to make notes because I don't want to miss a thing. But I'm very keen to hear your thoughts. Good evening, Theo. Thanks so much for joining us. What's your first reaction when you heard that so many countries, except Russia, seems to have been affected by these trade adjustments?
Well, Eilenet, my first reaction was the word Monroe, because the Monroe Doctrine is a doctrine that determined American foreign policy for decades. And that really means that the American foreign policy means that they'd rather be involved on the continent where they live, with neighbors to the south and neighbors to the north, which of course they have some issues with at the moment. But basically they don't want to get involved in global wars. They tried to stay out of it in the First World War. They were forced in. They tried to stay out in the Second World War. Pearl Harbor brought them in. And then after that, of course, they remained in global politics and global defense. And we can think of Kuwait and we can think of Iran and all those places and Afghanistan. But now with Donald Trump, he's saying, make America great again, as his slogan says, that let's sort ourselves out and let's focus on America. And to do that, he's using the term tariff. And of course, this is the first time in about almost 100 years that the Americans are using tariffs again. And tariffs, although there is something to say about it, it's really a two-edged sword, because you increase the price on goods coming from outside, which is kind of like a tax, and people don't see it that way, but it's like a tax. But on the other side, you're making American goods more expensive, and you're making it more difficult to trade. And we are now, I would say, the last 30 years or so, in a period of globalization, and globalization meant free trade. The World Trade Organization said, let's get rid of tariffs, because tariffs are very often a disturbing factor in global trade. And what the Americans now did over the last week is they have introduced tariffs to the extent that we haven't seen in a very long time. And I'm not sure that these tariffs are what they are. I think very often, in most cases, it is like Donald Trump is now out of his movie series of making deals. He's using tariffs to force some kind of deals. But that is not necessarily the case, and we shouldn't simplify American policy in that sense. I'm fortunate that I studied there for 2 years, and I've kept American foreign policy and American politics as part of my interest for the last 30 years. So when I look at Donald Trump, remember I said the first word that came to mind was Monroe, and the second word that came to Trump was, what a personality.
There's been so many commentators saying, on the one hand, that they don't know how the math was not mathing, with regards to how it was determined and worked out what percentages would be added onto every country. That was the one part. Another commentator saying that you should not take, for a very long time, everybody's taking his utterances as, oh, what a fool, buffoonery, don't take him seriously. But now all of that is having a knock-on effect, and that you no longer can really just sit and wait for the next wave of decisions or actions You would have heard that maximum velocity of Stephen
Mm,
that
mm.
said, or you can overwhelm them with information. They don't know where to look at. We can no longer afford to have that approach.
Well, I would share with you three thoughts. The one is whether you like Donald Trump or not, he is the American president for the next 4 years. Well, what is left of 4 years. And name calling is not going to get you anywhere. It is
Mm,
uh, pragmatism to see how you can deal with it. That is what is going to get you anywhere. The second thought is that tariffs has got a different kind of reaction from countries outside of America, and that is they are now saying, but let's trade with each other. Let's leave the
mm,
American market. Now, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. The American market is the largest consumer market in the world. Everybody wants to sell things to America, even Lesotho, that is now being hit with a 50%. That's why you said the maths don't math. In any case, so and the last of the three ideas that I have is that you will see an increase in trade um, in terms of individual countries with each other. Let me give you an example. NATO is currently considering whether the Americans are still a reliable partner. Now, America contributes the largest portion of NATO's defense and defense spending and so on. But
mm,
with Donald Trump and the way he's dealing and the whole peace process in Ukraine and Russia, you mentioned Russia in your introduction, there is no tariffs because there's no trade. Therefore, there is no tariffs. But the thing that the NATO countries are saying is, you know what, we do make good tanks. The Germans especially. Let's buy German tanks, not American ones. The Swedes are
mm.
making very good aeroplanes. Let's buy Swedish Gripens rather than American F-16s. So suddenly, um, nations are looking at the challenge of tariffs differently. And I think that
Mm.
is what the Americans also will have to bring into their whole thinking about. They've now made this announcement. And then maybe a fourth idea, the last one, is tariffs, the way in which it was explained, has to do with trade between countries of goods. If I can say that in Afrikaans, goeders wat jy kan vat. In other words, physical
Yeah.
things. We send macadamia nuts to the Americans. The Americans send John Deere's to us, physical things. But the American
Mm.
economy over the last 30, 40 years have changed from making commodities to
To
services. The,
consuming.
the Amer-
Mm.
yeah, the Americans are now selling to us Microsoft. They're selling to us all kinds of things. Even this program that we're talking on is based on a certain platform which is American based. There is Google and there is Amazon Web Services and all these kind of things. That is not brought into the deal when they worked out the maths about the tariffs. So the Americans sell to us intangible things, but it is not calculated. And that, I think, is a mistake in their thinking.
I want to get back to some of the points that you made in a moment, particularly touching on the new alliances, because we saw how Japan and China and South Korea, given their history, problematic history, and the tensions and the undercurrents that we've seen over the years, that they have come together as a bloc to look at new ways of forging alliances, of working together. Like you said earlier on, maybe we don't look at America, we look at Germany. You said, look at the Swedes, that there's now that kind of reaching beyond or recreating business without the US in the picture.
Yeah, it will be very difficult. But I think that is where the thinking is going. And remember, if people start thinking in a certain direction, actions follow very soon afterwards. So um, in strategy and in planning and in these kind of things, the most important element um, are the thinking of people. How do they look at things? what are the perceptions? And what is currently happening, the Americans are forming a kind of an anti-American perception. And it is not, if I say anti-American, it's not only Iran or those places that typically is shown. This anti-American attitude is now in Canada. It is in Mexico. It is in Europe, where people are saying, "What on earth is going on here?" And what if we look at the global relationship? There are two major trading conglomerates, sometimes called hegemons. The one is China, and the one is America. And what worries me, sitting in a country that represents less than 1% of the global economy, South Africa, currently the chairperson of the G20, which it seems to be the Americans, is going to make a horrible year for us. But in any case, what I see is that what the Americans are now creating are certain trade vacuums where people are saying, well, we have to look elsewhere. We have to maybe develop new relations. The Chinese, for them to survive, the survival of the Chinese economy is based on trade, is based on being a trading nation. They must sell things so that they can sustain whatever happens inside China with the 1.2 billion people. And I think they are just loving what is going on here. Despite the tariffs being put on them, it's 25% plus 34%. It's beyond 50% tariffs on Chinese. Now, they can do two things, and they can, because it's a centralized economy. They can say, okay, we'll absorb the tariffs and we will export at the same price. That means our stuff will not be more expensive in America. That in that way, we will stay very competitive. That because what tariffs does, it takes your competitive advantage away. Suddenly, the stuff that we sell to the Americans, and we sell things to them, is suddenly 30%, 31% more expensive. The question is, can we absorb that 30%? No, we cannot. And what I'm going to share with you, I'm not going to name the names, but I spoke to a company yesterday which said to me, okay, we are now faced with a 31% tariff on stuff that the Americans can't get enough of. But if you add 31% to my price, I'm not competitive in the American market. For me to be competitive, I will have to at least lay off 40 of my people working in this smallish company, but they're going to lay off 40 people so as to absorb some of the costs, so as to maintain that market. So American tariffs also has a socio-economic impact on the countries that it is supposed to force in some form of a new economic deal or whatever. Now, South Africa is not a good example here because we are now known in Washington, and that is not a good thing to be known by name. It's not a good thing to have all these funny things and the big spyglass on us, the Afrikaner especially, the guys that visited, the business guys, the ambassador. They even fired our consular general in California, and they send our mission back. And the interesting part here, and that is also visible in the TikTok by the Singapore president. Singapore said, we are not going to retaliate. We are going to see how we can absorb it. It seems to me South Africa is also not retaliating, because if you kick my attaché out or my ambassador, typically in diplomatic language, it's tit for tat. If you kick me out, whether I'm guilty or not, I kick you out. And this time around, we got kicked out, our ambassador, our attaché, our consul general, and we haven't done a thing. So it seems to me we have decided not to retaliate. It's not formally said, there's no announcement, but it seems to me that's the thinking in the South African case. And I think a lot of countries, except China, that already said will retaliate. England is saying that they'll retaliate. The Canadians said we're going to retaliate. or um, at least put the same kind of limitations on trade, which is extremely difficult. And the other thing, and maybe that is just something from South Africa, in 1997, 1997, the National Party, then in control of the apartheid state prior to 1994, had a 1977, sorry, not 1997, 1977. They had a snap election, and at that time, Jimmy Carter was putting tremendous pressure on South Africa, firstly on basis of the apartheid problem, but also the independence of Namibia. And in that snap election, John Foster said, okay, we are not fighting the opposition parties. We're not fighting Van Zyl Slabbert. We're fighting Jimmy Carter. And the National Party had its largest victory ever in 1977. And I think that is what's going to happen in Canada in their election on, I think it's the 28th of April, because they are having an election against Donald Trump, not against the opposition parties, but against a common enemy. And that usually works very, very well. So you can see the trade tariffs that you would like to talk to and that we are talking about has got a trade element, but it's got a socio-economic element, it's got a political element, it's got a jobless element.
That's why I wanted us to unpack all the implications of these liberation announcements, because you mentioned socioeconomic impact. I've seen an insert about how Brazil, for example, and Colombia will be affected. I think they had about a 10% tariff increase that's been put on them, and they were saying that
10% is across the board.
Yeah, for them. And because they were specifically talking about the implications of that, because America seems to be the biggest country that accepts their coffee beans, and we all know how popular and how big the coffee market in the USA is. So they were talking to that. But you mentioned now the response that we've seen in Canada. And maybe you can think of other countries where this has not divided people, but has actually brought them together. We saw also those millions of Americans that went to protest, and those protests and those marches all across the USA. So first, speak to the tariffs that did not divide, but and some of the utterances that we've seen from Donald Trump, but that is actually unified a lot of people. Canada in point you mentioned, and then let's talk about the pushback. And then there's a third point that I want to put on the table, and that there's some thinking that say, particularly from the Republicans and other MAGA supporters as well, that have said, well, let's wait for the midterms. And many believe that you cannot wait for the midterms, but what alternatives are there? Because I think that Americans feel we are becoming, and Afrikaans is our meisond, that America, because of its president, is becoming the I don't want to insult Americans. They do.
Yeah, because you won't become ambassador by insulting.
Yeah, no, clearly. So let's talk about the unification of countries and citizens of certain countries beyond Canada as well. Let's talk about the impact of that, and then talk about the pushback that we've seen in the US, and can you really afford to wait till the midterms? And I know afterwards, in the second half of our discussion, I'd like us to talk about South Africa and AGOA and the implications of that.
Yeah, you see, in the announcement, what is now called Liberation Day, what struck me was, in a country where freedoms are very well secured, in a country where freedom of speech and all these kind of things is a given, being some limitations, but it's one of the freest places that you can operate, whatever you do. Um, it's, I mean, just to drive the point about freedom of speech, this is the biggest producer of pornography in the world. That means whatever they're doing, they've got the freedom to do even that. But they call it Freedom Day. And it is funny to me because, and we'll get to South Africa later on, we have organizations in South Africa on the right of politics, let's call them conservative. They love the term freedom. They call themselves the Freedom Front. Freedom of what? Or if they talk about freedom, then sometimes clearly you can see the term freedom is actually an ideological term. It is not a term with a specific designation that they are in some form of colonial situation where they need to go through a process of liberation or something like that. And then if you listen to Trump, before I get to how nations respond, you can hear he talks about America being given the worst kind of, they dealt the bad ball. America is done in by the rest of the world.
Yeah.
In
Abused, bad
yeah,
treatment.
yeah, in Afrikaans we would call this ons is te nagekom. America is the
Yeah.
one that is really, but in any case, that is a
They've been the victim.
mindset. Yeah, it's this victim mindset drives a lot of things. If you really feel politically and otherwise that you're a victim, then it is driving you to do kind of these things. Now, like I previously said, American foreign policy is a very complicated beast. One of the best cartoons that I remember from 20, 30 years ago was a cartoon where the Americans are fighting with their tanks and things in the deserts of Kuwait. And then this little dog in the cartoon holds a little poster. And the one American officer is asking the other one, why don't they like us? The Arabian people or the Kuwaiti people or whatever. So this little dog on his poster said, it's American foreign policy, stupid. So that is, in a sense, what we're experiencing. And American foreign policy sometimes do exactly what you're saying. Canada is now a case in point, where it brings together Canadians. And the interesting part is the Canadian conservative opposition is very much in the libertarian kind of tradition, much closer to Trump. But with tariffs, nobody in Canada can truly justify tariffs. In other words, the conservative side in Canada is kind of in a problem, because if they start supporting Trump, the current Liberal Party would say, well, there you've got it. They are actually going to sell us out, and they're going to make us the 51st state, which we are not going to allow. We see similar reactions in Europe. We see that in Germany. We see that in England and in France especially. Now, in France and in England, two cases in point. When Trump wanted people to assist him in the peace process in Ukraine versus Russia, he decided not to utilize the European Union, but he selected two countries, France and England. And what happened with the British political system, Keir Starmer is becoming far more, he's moving, he's gravitating towards the center. Keir Starmer, as a Labour premier, is doing exactly what Tony Blair did 20 years ago. He came in from the left and he moved to the middle. Donald Trump is causing that. The same with politics in France. The fact that Marine Le Pen has gone through a court case and she may not stand, that's a problem on its own. But the right wing in France is really mobilizing very strongly. And with Donald Trump's penalties and tariffs, they are really at odds, and they will probably be a retaliation or a reaction against the right wing, because people are saying, but the right wing guys are playing into the American hands. So we see this, and I'm just
Yes.
mentioning two or three, but we see this
Mm,
all
mm,
over the place, how people respond to tariffs. But I think the most, um, I would say, balanced response came from the new uh, premier of Canada that must still be formally elected. He's appointed but not yet elected, Carney. And Carney
Connie.
being the president of the Canadian Reserve Bank, and after that, the same with the British central bank, is a very, very well equipped public official. People criticize him for not being a politician. I think it's a good thing. He worked with politicians for the last 30 years, so he knows exactly how to deal with them. And the fact that he has been so well spoken and that he has been so clear about what Canada must do vis-a-vis the Americans and how it will be dealt
Mm,
with, tells you that it brings leadership out in people. I referred earlier on to the Singaporean president, which was a very balanced response to this issue, and so on. So, yeah, that's one of the things. It shows us who can deal with it and who cannot. When we get to South Africa, I think I will be a little bit more critical about response, because I don't think
yeah.
our response is measuring up to what we're seeing globally. And then the last thing that I would
And
like to say
the
is
pushback,
is
yeah.
uh, the pushback. Countries like Brazil, and I've got sympathy with the coffee story, but Brazil has got a very competitive aircraft industry. They make aircraft called the Embraer, different types, and currently countries are looking, especially those countries that's well involved in C-130s, in other words, the so-called Hercules, that we call Hercules. There's a competitor now being manufactured in Brazil called the Embraer 390. The Netherlands already decided to buy one, and several countries in Europe, South Africa is looking at it, and we're saying, let's drop this 50 to 60-year commitment to the Hercules or the C-130, which is a wonderful plane. It's a classic, but let's move to a country that we can really trust in terms of delivery.
Mm. And what's your thoughts on the pushback that we saw yesterday in the United States? That it seems that people are now starting to mobilize, those that are anxious about what's happening to their country and the policy and all these departments being closed down, and rumors that because of Tesla's performance, how that's impacted not only on the global perception of the US, and we spoke about it earlier on, but the real economics of what's happening, and that they're facing a possible recession, and who in the end are going to suffer the most. Because we've also seen a lot of reports trying to comfort them and say, this is it's immediate pain but long-term gain. That's how they're selling it. So let's talk about that for a moment.
Okay, I think most of our listeners know that the Americans have elections every 2 years. In terms of their constitution, they have an election on the second Tuesday of November every second year. Every fourth year, the president gets elected. But in the in-between years, the whole House of Representatives, they serve a 2-year term, are elected. And that happens in November next year, 2026. So what typically happens with the president in his second term is that by the time that you reach the midterm elections, it's 2 years into a 4-year term, the president then becomes a lame duck. In Afrikaans, we
Mm.
call it a flou makou. So we will see how the lame duck Trump looks. Why do they become a lame duck? Firstly, because over 80 years, the incumbent usually lose votes in the midterm election, and in a case where the Senate and the House are almost 50-50. If the Democrats can get their act together, and they have trouble getting their act together, but if they can, I mean, the marches that I saw over the last day or so tells me something is happening. They can then move that power relationship so that the Democrats can control both the Senate and the House. That will make it very difficult for Donald Trump to execute his executive orders. Now, remember, he has the absolute right to execute these executive orders, but he needs the money from Congress to fund those decisions. He can take the decision, but the purse sits at a different place. If the purse is closed, then you can write executive orders until you're blue. They're not going to get the funding to get them executed. That's why in the second part of your last term, it's very difficult. And then already in the second part of your last term, the new president is coming forward, either Democrat or Republican. In this case, I think J.D. Vance is being trained, educated, taught, whatever you want to do it, introduced into the presidency. He will be a very young president if he makes it, and he will, of course, continue what Trump is doing. And that, I think, is the positive scenario for Trump, and that is to get J.D. Vance as soon as possible ready for the presidency. He has the judges in the Supreme Court already conservative jurists, so the Supreme Court is not going to give them problems. In the House, they've got a majority that is workable, a very slim majority, but it's workable. But if that relationship changes, then you will see a whole different situation. And I don't think the Americans can do anything until it's time for the midterms. They may continue with their civic action, if we can call it that. And it should influence the president, because in a country like South Africa and England and those places, people don't understand really the role of the individual voter, because our presidents, and the same with the Canadian case, our premiers or presidents are indirectly elected. So the winning party elects a leader, and that leader becomes the national leader. But in America, the American president is elected directly by the people, like the French president. So he must be sensitive to what people are saying. And if he's not sensitive, he's failing his presidency. So I think these issues, and there's of course a different control on the president, not only the individual voter, almost 250 million of them, but there's also the markets. The stock markets hasn't been nice to Trump after the announcement of the tariffs over the last 2 days, and this ugly R word, recession, is now echoing,
popping up everywhere.
Yeah, and that should be a worry. And that's why I think MAGA, Make America Great Again, goes with this almost sub-slogan. It will be hard in the beginning, but later on we're going to have gain, and we will gain. I think that is a little bit of political justification. I can almost call it political BS as well.
Yeah, I'm going to allow you to quickly take a sip of your coffee, because you had mentioned so much of the history of America and international policy. And I recall seeing two videos of George W. Bush, and the other one was Ronald Reagan. I don't know if you saw it, where they spoke about trade tariffs as a punitive measure and protectionist measure, and that history within America has shown that it does not work, that you have to find your way around that. So let's, and just for the viewers that came in late, we're talking about Liberation Day announcements, how it's affecting trade around the world, if it does indeed mean the end of trade as we know it, and that it's introduced a new world order. I hear that word being bandied about a lot. If you take the time and if you have time and you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, there are two interviews that I've had in the last 2 months. One with Professor William Gumede, where he was talking about that we are already in World War III, and that he mentioned specifically these trade wars. That was the beginning, way before Liberation Day announcements, where he was talking about Trump's utterances about South Africa, and also the way he treated President Zelensky. So that was the context there. And then I did a follow-up interview with a professor in the USA who spoke about immigration law. And one of the things that she mentioned, Theo, and I want to get your opinion on that. She said that we're facing in the USA a constitutional crisis. Is that what you would also, how you'd also describe it? Your read on that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think this constitutional crisis has to do with how much power resides in the presidency. What can the president do? Up to this stage, and that includes Reagan, includes all of the presidents that we can think of, there was this holy respect. And I use the word holy with its religious meaning. There was this holy respect between the legislature, the courts, and the executive, and that there's a balancing of forces which comes for more than 200 years, because we must remember the American Constitution was a response to what the founding fathers experienced in Great Britain. And there they said, never again will we allow the courts to be manipulated by the king. Never again will we allow the parliament to be manipulated by the king, but we would like to have somebody like a king. We're going to call him a president, but we're going to put limits on him. We're going to put legal limits on him, and we're going to put legislative limits on him. And that's really the essence of the American system. It is an old British system adapted for America for 1777 and still in process today. Now, if you're a conservative jurist in America, it means when you interpret the legislation, the statute, you interpret it as if it was written today, even if it's 200 years old. If it said something is red, then it's red. You cannot interpret it in the modern day lingo or the modern day understanding. If you're a liberal jurist, it means that you then interpret the Constitution in terms of modern day context, and that is where the trouble starts. The Trump guys, Trump firstly took the Republican Party, and he converted the Republican Party into what used to be called the Tea Party faction of the Republican Party. So he really took that design and he made it the party. Secondly, when you're not in power, in other words, when you're not a president, then typically a political party in America, Democratic or Republic, don't have a clear-cut leader. There's usually a committee that runs the party, and then when they have a president for a presidential election, that person, man, male, female, will be the party leader for the next 4 years. Trump did something different. When he lost the previous election to Biden, he maintained his hold on the Republican Party. So he got this conservative approach of the Republican Party very, very well organized. And that's why when he started his presidency, everything was really already in place. I mean, you can't sign 100 executive orders, let's say in the first week or the first 3 or 4 days of your presidency, if a team wasn't working on those for 3 months before the time. So you can see that they were really prepared for this second
That's
term.
Why Project
And
2025 came into play.
Which he, of course, denied, but you're quite right. Where I see problems is the way in which Trump is bullying universities. Where I see trouble is where he is um, where he exchanged something the Americans were good at, and that is soft power. In other words, you pay for an AIDS clinic in South Africa not because you like the South Africans, but because you think it's the right thing to do. That's
True.
soft power. And that means you have some influence, but not directly, indirectly. Trump absolutely kicked out the soft approach, and he is all about the hard political influence of the Americans. He wants to be in your face, and he wants to do it absolutely where you can see it, and that creates all kinds of problems. And this constitutional crisis also includes a thing, for instance, like your birthright. If you're born in a country, you have kind of globally the acceptance that you have citizenship of that country. He's now saying, no, 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 no. If the parents are illegally here and the child is born on American soil, this child cannot be an American. Um, it used to be accepted that way, but it is now changing. He is now saying, no, we will have to change this. It is it's not acceptable anymore, and we uh, we are going to chase these guys out of the country. Um, and I think that is part of the case, and the courts will have to look at these things. And I think the constitutional crisis will emerge when there's not only a rebellion against Trump and his tariffs, but when people are going to rise against the courts and saying, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. That's not there yet, but it's developing.
Yeah, you see the current and the utterances. You definitely see also the relationship with judiciary and how some of those orders, not the executive orders, the orders of making sure let whoever they've deported bring them back, how that is ignored or worked around. Let's talk about South Africa because there's a lot at play here. I started off by saying the road of good intentions is often paved with disastrous consequences.
Uh,
We had this whole the I would say the way it was framed from Solidarity and AfriForum and the like about what was supposedly happening in South Africa, but that it was to protect and to help white Afrikaners and in particular farmers. But if you look at these tariffs now, our farmers are going to suffer. There is no way around it. No matter how you try and frame it, they will not be unaffected. A lot of our big exports, our big companies in South Africa, agricultural companies, have and do business with America. A lot of our South African farmers go and work on a special H2 visa, go work on
yeah.
American farms. So they nobody is untouched in this.
No, nobody's untouched, and one must be careful not to have a doom and gloom view. You're quite right in what you've said, but uh, in the previous round, when the Americans had tariffs against China, the Chinese said, okay, we will stop importing any of the American macadamias or any of the nuts. And then they were looking around for which countries produce nuts, and they found South Africa. So we had a bumper market then with the Chinese, and I think that's going to happen again. So although the farmers in the Western Cape, citrus especially, are having
Citrus
difficulty, and the
especially.
wines and so on, that is absolutely so. But I think there's also farmers that are going to gain. The other thing is uh, pragmatism. If I looked at all the tariffs, like we've said previously, if you're not in the American spotlight and you don't have something bad around you, you get a 10% tariff, everybody. But if they don't like you for some other reason, the number is different. And I looked around and I saw that Mozambique only has a 17% tariff, Namibia only has a 20% tariff. Uh, Zambia has got something like a 19% tariff. And suddenly I realized there's going to be a lot of exports from Mozambique, Namibia, and Zambia to America of South African goods. I can just see that happening because that's what pragmatism means. You will get around it.
Find a way
Don't,
around it. Mm.
and that is why when you said previous president said we've tried tariffs, it's not working. There's something else that's also not working, and that is sanctions. Um, they want to sanction ANC leaders, or so it seems from this legislation. Well, they have sanctioned the Russians, the worst sanctions that we've ever seen against Russia. In other words, preventing them from selling oil to Europe, for instance, or gas. So what
Mm.
happened? The Indians, the Indian government, Indian companies bought oil from Russia because there was no limitation between India and Russia. India did not participate in those sanctions. Those oil was then taken up by Indian companies and sold to the rest of the world as Indian oil, which India don't have. They don't have oil wells, but now they're selling oil and they're making a huge profit out of that. So can you see how people circumvent sanctions? So neither
Mm.
sanctions nor tariffs in the long term really work. And therefore, I think the proper way to look at the American approach at the moment, it's a negotiating tool. Um, Trump is doing this to see what he can gain, because what is it that Trump wants to do? And that is the essence of the whole tariff story. If you look at his promises in the campaign, he made a few promises, but the most important promise was, I will bring down the cost of living. Now, the cost of living in America is driven by especially the cost of energy. And the cost of
Mm.
energy equals the cost of fuel, gas in America, petrol in South Africa. Same thing.
Mm.
How do you get the price of gas down, petrol? Well, you get the price of oil down. And that is already happening. So,
Mm.
and that is where South Africa is going to gain, because we, in a world of uncertainty, the price of gold increases, which is a gain for us,
Yes.
and the price of oil
Yes.
is going
Confirm.
down. That's a gain for us. So, although it may be negative in political terms and so on, there are some good out of this, and we must be open minded to see that as well. So, if Trump gets a solution to the Ukraine war in some way or another, and he can buy Russian oil again, the price of oil is going to drop because there will be too much oil in the world. That means
Mm.
his first promise of getting the cost of living down, he can tick. He can say, I've done it. The second thing that he can say is, I have given the world a good show and a good run for their money, and we are now producing our own things, and that is making America great again. And the last thing is that he will tell his supporters, and I just want to stop with his supporters quickly. If you look at the
Mm.
election, Kamala Harris lost the election to Donald Trump. Donald Trump won handsomely if you look at all the constituencies in America. But if you count the numbers, Donald Trump's winning margin was 49.2%, and Kamala Harris got 48.1%. So it was within 1 percentage point of each other. In other words, 77 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. It's a given, it's a fact. But 75 million voted for Kamala Harris. So if he says the whole of America is supporting me, it must be taken with a little pinch of salt.
Punch. Mm. Mm. Let's talk about South Africa. You said it's not all doom and gloom, and you pointed out ways around it. And I was thinking while you were saying that because there is also this that seems to be building, the fact that he's alienated the alliances and his allies in Europe and elsewhere, Canada and Mexico, for example, it has drawn the attention of the world to South Africa again. that there are possibilities. I mean, if I was an outsider, I would ask myself, why is he targeting this country? There must be something there. And we'll look at it simply not just taking Donald Trump's word and his assertions for as the truth, but looking at other alliances. Yes, a lot of our products and we've gained by AGOA, and this is obviously going to have a huge impact on that trade agreement. But let's talk a little bit about that, and also the fact that you say it's not everything is not gloom and doom, that they can, as always, from a supposedly bad, initially bad situation, something good can come forth.
I think if you want to know why is South Africa in the spotlight in Washington, D.C., we're a small country. We've got some strategic value. We've got some interesting resources like manganese and chromium and all those kind of things. But I think if I mention four words, you'll understand why we in the spotlight. The first word is Palestine. The second
Mm,
word is the International Court of Justice. The third word is Iran. And then the
mm,
fourth word is possibly China and BRICS and these kind of things. So the Americans have a
yeah.
very simplified view of the world. If you're not for us, you're against us. And we, I think what we have done in South Africa, and that is, if I can criticize the South African government um, in all their responses so far, they played exactly the same game Trump is playing, and that is the victim game. We're victimized, we're bullied. We will not be bullied by the Americans. I have seen very little introspection. I've seen
Mm,
very little um, political comments saying, guys, you know what? I think I think the Trump administration is right. We may have just overwhelmed
understood.
or went too far with some of these things. And my wish, my advice to the South African government would be to go and sit firstly and involve your members of the GNU. Don't do it on your own
Mm,
like you tried to do with the
mm,
budget. Get your partners in government, sit and have a think tank about how do we deal with America, because there's more than one answer. Thirdly, get ideology out of that meeting. Get pragmatism in. Ideology means we will only do this and we will only do that. Let me give you an example. South Africa is a very water poor country. It's not that we don't have enough water, but our management of water is not good. Who is the
mm,
best managers of water in the world? It's Israel. If you really want to understand high tech about how to get your crops sorted out, how to manage your water, you use Israeli technology. But if you
mm,
ideologically bound into the problems of Palestine and you put Israel into a little box saying, we can't talk to these guys because they're just not on, you're stupid. I think you're just stupid, and I think that
mm,
is what we need in our foreign policy, is to look at the Americans a little bit different. Russia, of course, isn't the problem anymore because Lady R, although it's mentioned in this legislation, the Americans want to push through, but both. Putin, or both Trump and Ramaphosa now has got access to Putin. So we're equal on that one. And the other thing is that Trump is also very adamant that our role in BRICS is way, way too dominant. Now,
yes.
when BRICS was formed and we got invited, people kind of made a joke and they said, "Well, we're the small brick in the wall because we're the smallest economy." the, the now that BRICS is a far larger association, but BRICS is not an economic advantage. BRICS is like the politics of the South, the politics
Mm,
of the countries that forms the global South, so to speak, of which the most important countries are actually North. They're not South. China is in the northern hemisphere. Russia is in the northern hemisphere. And the funny part, and this is the lesson that I would point out to the South African government, the G20, of which we're currently the chairperson for this year, also
Mm.
includes Brazil, China, and Russia, but they're also in BRICS. So there's a kind of a pragmatism there that I think we should look at very clearly and see what it is that we can do to adjust. I'm not saying change our foreign policy. That I wouldn't expect the ANC to do. But where you can adjust it, where you can soften it, that's what we should do.
You mentioned earlier that the response has been the victimhood, that South Africa has taken that road, but also that there wasn't any clear direction of what our stance is going to be. You said that South Africa hasn't pushed back in the way like China, for example, where they said, well, we are going to increase our tariffs as well. At this point in time, are you convinced that we have a clear international strategy on how we're going to deal with America, with the utterances and the claims that Donald Trump has made? You would have seen that this Afrikaner policy has now also been tabled and suggested. The whole the utterances of the claims that were made and the severity of that, that our South Africa's are very, very bad. There are bad things going on there. Talk me through that. If you're convinced that there's a clear international policy of how we're going to deal with this and who are we sending? Because we can't send Ibrahim Rasool anymore. Are we going to now look at someone that is acceptable to the US? How are we going to approach that? Let's talk about that. Because that affects perceptions as well.
Yeah, what about Herman Mashaba? He's a businessman. We call him the Black Trump. Maybe he's the guy. No, it's just a joke.
Yeah, I was about to tell you, because the stuff I heard now with the voting on the VAT and the things that people are saying about that. So let's not. It's April the 1st has passed. Theo, just
introspection. Introspection, I think, is part of the answer. If Solidarity and AfriForum says we've tried to talk to government, they wouldn't even answer our letters. That is a serious thing. If the government can say we've clearly heard what these groups are saying, we're not necessarily agreeing with them. We're not agreeing with their messages, but at least the one area that we can work on is to get this national discussion forum going, and we will invite AfriForum and Solidarity to sit in there. That is already a positive response, because we must remember that Donald Trump does not take these decisions on his own. Donald Trump operates within an echo chamber, and these guys are very well into the networks done by Ernst Roots and by Kali Kriel and these guys. So they know exactly what goes on in South Africa. That we must accept. And they then interpret what goes on in South Africa for the American president. And if he then gets that message, he then just splurts it out. He gives it like he gave that formula that nobody can work out. So he's not a president that looks into things deeply. He trusts his advisors very often and very much. He trusts them, so he will do what they're saying. But I think there's a lot of things that our government can do to change things a little bit. And one of the things is to get things going in South Africa. And it doesn't help to say there's no genocide in the country. We that live here know that. But you have to demonstrate a little bit more. You have to go to the Minister of Police and let him make available the statistics and show that we don't have genocide. But guys, we've got a serious gang problem in the Western Cape. We've got a serious organized crime problem in the Eastern Cape. We've got a serious taxi war system going on in KwaZulu-Natal, and then there are some places in Gauteng where things are not going well. So can you help us by sending us a few FBI guys with the newest technology? Now, you see, if you start doing that, then you're engaging. But if you're just protecting and you're reacting ideologically, personally, I think our Minister of Foreign Affairs, called Dirko, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, which is a very weird name. We're the only country in the world that uses that. I think he's very, very light. In Afrikaans, lig in die broek. I think we need somebody more politically adept, more serious, to be our Minister of Foreign Affairs. I don't have a lot of confidence in Lamola running this business.
You were saying about introspection that needs to happen, and it reminds me of a saying that that you cannot manage that which you don't acknowledge. So if you don't acknowledge that where the areas are that you need to focus on, you can't manage it because you're in denial of that. And it's actually interesting because you see that also with the ultimatums and the way the members within the GNU and the tensions between the ANC and the DA, for example, is being handled now. So, there's always this underlying threat. And you need to understand, if you're going to call yourself a GNU, you actually need to live it. As you said, the actions have to follow all those words that you utter. So let's talk about quickly as we wrap. What are we saying to South Africans with all these tariffs? What are we saying to them in terms of our economy? What are we saying about the 5.1% VAT that we now have to wrap our heads around? What are we saying to them?
Well, the first thing that I would say to them is that take some time and read through the court papers that the DA lodged on Friday. I think it's Friday. It can be Thursday as well. There's some merit in some of those things the DA is pointing out. For instance, Parliament has very little to say about a half percentage point increase in VAT. The minister can do that on his own. He's using Parliament for something that he can do himself. In that sense, there's a big constitutional question around that. Secondly, what they're arguing is that the way in which the committees worked in Parliament is not constitutionally correct, and that should be looked at. So that is just a legality on this one side. But what we're really saying to them is that the South African economy is not at a good place. We're growing barely 0.5%. If we then add tariffs like the Americans want, 31%, it will take us into negative growth, because so far, every time, at least twice a year, it was the growth in agriculture that got us economically where we are. And so the impact, agriculture is not big in the economy, but its impact directly and indirectly, let's call it downstream and upstream, is fairly, it goes from the farm to the Pick n Pay. And people work out that is between 15 and 17% of the economy. So it's fairly big. We need to look at our agriculture, and we need to protect the agricultural ability against the sanctions, therefore, or the tariffs. Therefore, government needs to help in government-to-government negotiations with other countries and other markets. Therefore, you leave John Steenhuisen as Minister of Agriculture. His role now is even more important than it previously was. Secondly, you leave Leon Schreiber, where he's doing good work at the Department of the Interior. And you leave Dean McPherson at infrastructure because he's doing a good job. So basically what I'm saying to South Africans, if we want the economy to grow, that's the essence of what we now need. We need to make the government of national unity work, whether they had whatever trouble. And then thirdly, what I'm saying is, let's talk to each other. don't do things and don't isolate people. Get Flip Base, get Kali Kriel into this national debate about where we're going, and get all other guys that feel they've got a contribution, get them in. But be careful. Don't ask the deputy president to run this negotiations. Get your NGOs, get your Christo van der Redes, get your Thabo Mbeki institutes, get your all these different think tanks and institutes. Let them